When the new VP called my entire department redundant during his first company meeting, he had no idea he was about to eliminate the team that generated 89% of the company's total revenue. By the time he discovered his catastrophic mistake, it was already too late to undo the damage he'd inflicted on himself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Baltimore headquarters conference room buzzed with their usual mechanical hum, casting everything in that corporate pallor that made even the healthiest complexion look slightly sickly. I sat in my usual spot near the back, nursing my third cup of coffee and watching the steam curl up from the ceramic mug that read, "World's Most Average Employee," a gag gift from my team that had become my favorite piece of office equipment. Rachel Morrison had been running the Client Retention and Revenue Recovery Department for 6 years, ever since the previous manager had suffered what the company diplomatically called stress-related health issues, after losing 3 major accounts in a single quarter. What they didn't mention in the official announcement was that those accounts represented nearly $12 million in annual revenue, and the fallout had nearly bankrupted the mid-sized consulting firm. The department I inherited was a graveyard of broken client relationships, unpaid invoices, and burned bridges that previous sales teams had left in their wake. Most people saw it as career suicide. I saw it as an opportunity to prove that sometimes the most valuable work happens in the shadows, away from the spotlight and executive praise. Marcus Webb strutted into the conference room 15 minutes late, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished concrete floor with the kind of aggressive confidence that belonged in a courtroom rather than a consulting firm. Everything about him screamed expensive. The tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most employees made in a month, the Swiss watch that caught the light every time he gestured, the perfectly styled hair that suggested regular visits to salons I couldn't afford. He'd been hired as the new vice president of operations with a mandate to, quote, streamline efficiency and eliminate redundancy across all departments. The board had poached him from a Fortune 500 company where he'd allegedly saved them $20 million through strategic downsizing. What they didn't mention was that half of those savings had evaporated within 2 years, when the company lost several major contracts due to understaffing and poor client relationships. Marcus didn't bother with introductions or pleasantries. He connected his laptop to the projection system and launched directly into his presentation with the enthusiasm of a surgeon preparing to remove a particularly troublesome tumor. The first slide appeared on the wall in stark black and white. Operational Efficiency Review Phase 1. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who'd given this speech before. "We're here today because this company has been bleeding money through inefficient resource allocation and redundant departmental structures that have outlived their usefulness." I felt my stomach tighten, but kept my expression neutral. Around the room, department heads shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Sarah from marketing was frantically taking notes on her tablet. David from IT had gone slightly pale and was staring at his hands. After conducting a thorough analysis of our current operational structure, Marcus continued, advancing to the next slide, "I've identified several departments that are consuming resources without generating proportional value for the organization." The slide that appeared made my blood run cold. It was a simple bulleted list titled "Departments Recommended for Restructuring," and there, third from the top, was my department, Client Retention and Revenue Recovery. Marcus's laser pointer traced a red circle around our department name. The Client Retention and Revenue Recovery Department represents a perfect example of redundant functionality that duplicates efforts already being handled more efficiently by our sales and customer service teams. The annual operating cost of this department, including salaries, benefits, and overhead, exceeds $400,000. My hands remained steady on my coffee mug, but inside, something was crystallizing into sharp, cold focus. $400,000. He'd done his homework on our costs, but apparently hadn't bothered to investigate our revenue generation. "The question we need to ask ourselves," Marcus continued, his tone taking on the patronizing quality of a professor explaining a simple concept to particularly slow students, "is whether we're getting adequate return on this investment. When we can reallocate these resources to departments that directly contribute to our bottom line, the choice becomes obvious. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some department heads were nodding along, probably relieved that their teams hadn't made the list. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps wondering if they'd be next on the chopping block. Effective immediately, Marcus announced, the Client Retention and Revenue Recovery Department will be dissolved. Current staff will be given the opportunity to interview for positions in other departments, and any ongoing projects will be redistributed to more appropriate teams. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my face impassive. 6 years of building something from nothing. 6 years of salvaging relationships that other people had written off as lost causes. 6 years of turning the company's biggest liabilities into its most reliable assets. Marcus was still talking, something about severance packages and transition timelines, but his voice had faded into background noise. My mind was racing through the implications of what he'd just announced. Did he have any idea what my department actually did? Had he looked at our revenue reports? Did he understand that we weren't just handling customer service complaints and retention calls? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I thought about the thick folder locked in my desk drawer, the one containing detailed reports on every account recovery, every salvaged contract, every relationship rebuilt from the ashes of someone else's mistakes. The folder that documented millions of dollars in revenue that would have been lost forever if not for the redundant department he'd just eliminated. After the meeting ended, I walked back to my office in a daze. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and I became acutely aware of the sympathetic glances from colleagues who'd witnessed my professional execution. By the time I reached my desk, word had already spread throughout the building. My phone was buzzing with text messages from team members who'd heard the news secondhand. The view from my office window overlooked the inner harbor, where tourists were boarding water taxis and couples were taking selfies against the backdrop of the historic ships. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that 20 floors above them, someone's career was being dismantled by a man who'd spent 3 weeks analyzing spreadsheets and thought he understood the business. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I'd been maintaining for years, detailed records of every account my department had handled, every relationship we'd rebuilt, every dollar we'd recovered from what other people had considered lost causes. The numbers told a story that Marcus Webb had apparently never bothered to read. In the past fiscal year alone, my team had recovered over $14 million in revenue from clients who had been ready to terminate their contracts. We'd rebuilt relationships with customers who had been so frustrated with the company's service that they were actively shopping for competitors. We'd negotiated payment plans for clients who owed significant back payments, preventing the company from having to write off millions in bad debt. But the real revelation was in the long-term revenue analysis. The clients we'd retained weren't just paying their current bills. They were renewing contracts, expanding services, and referring new business. The lifetime value of the relationships my department had salvaged over the past 6 years exceeded $47 million. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the numbers on my screen. $47 million in revenue that existed because of the redundant department that Marcus Webb had just eliminated. Revenue that would disappear when those carefully rebuilt relationships inevitably deteriorated without proper maintenance. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed Jennifer Walsh, the CEO of Morrison Industries, one of our largest clients. Jennifer and I had a history that went back 3 years, to when her company had been ready to sue us for breach of contract, after a spectacular failure by our previous project management team. Rachel, Jennifer's voice was warm but concerned. I just heard about the restructuring. Is it true that your department is being eliminated? I chose my words carefully. There have been some organizational changes, yes. I'm still working out the details of how it will affect our ongoing relationships. I need to be completely honest with you, Jennifer said, her tone becoming more serious. The only reason Morrison Industries stayed with your company after that disaster 3 years ago was because of the work you and your team did to rebuild our trust. If you're not going to be our point of contact anymore, we need to have a serious conversation about whether this partnership is still viable. After Jennifer hung up, I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of that conversation. Morrison Industries represented nearly $3 million in annual revenue. They weren't the only client who felt that way about my department's role in maintaining their relationship with the company. Over the next 2 hours, I received similar calls from 5 other major clients. Each conversation followed the same pattern: concern about the restructuring, questions about who would be handling their accounts, and subtle hints that they viewed my department as essential to their continued partnership with the company. By late afternoon, I had compiled a comprehensive analysis of what Marcus Webb's decision would actually cost the company. The immediate impact would be the loss of our department's direct revenue recovery efforts, which averaged about $2 million per quarter. But the long-term consequences would be devastating. Without dedicated relationship management, at least 60% of our recovered accounts would likely return to their previous pattern of delayed payments, reduced service levels, and eventual contract termination. The ripple effect would eliminate approximately $28 million in annual revenue within the first 18 months. I printed out my analysis and locked it in my desk drawer alongside the other documentation I'd been maintaining. Marcus Webb thought he was eliminating a cost center, but he was actually destroying the foundation that supported nearly 90% of the company's sustainable revenue. That evening, I drove home to my apartment in Federal Hill with a strange sense of calm settling over me. The initial shock of the announcement had given way to something else, a clarity that came from finally understanding the full scope of what was about to happen. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom, with exposed brick walls and large windows that offered a partial view of the harbor. I'd lived there for 4 years, ever since my divorce was finalized, and I needed a fresh start. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine, and it had served as my refuge during the most challenging period of rebuilding the department. I opened a bottle of wine and settled onto my couch with my laptop, pulling up the detailed files I'd been maintaining on every major client relationship. Each folder contained not just the financial data, but the personal notes about key decision-makers, their communication preferences, their concerns and priorities, and the specific strategies that had worked to rebuild their trust in the company. This wasn't just institutional knowledge. It was the result of hundreds of hours of careful relationship building, crisis management, and strategic problem solving. It was knowledge that couldn't be easily transferred to another department or replicated by reading a manual. As I scrolled through the files, I began to see a pattern that I'd never fully articulated before. Every major client recovery had involved not just solving their immediate problem, but addressing underlying systemic issues that had caused the problem in the first place. We weren't just a retention department. We were the company's early warning system for operational failures and quality control problems. When Morrison Industries had threatened to sue 3 years ago, it wasn't just because of one failed project. It was because of a series of communication breakdowns, missed deadlines, and quality issues that had been building for months. My department had not only resolved the immediate crisis, but had worked with internal teams to implement process improvements that prevented similar problems with other clients. The same pattern appeared in case after case. We weren't just putting band-aids on problems, we were diagnosing and treating the underlying diseases that were slowly killing client relationships throughout the company. I realized that Marcus Webb hadn't just misunderstood our function. He'd misunderstood the entire ecosystem of how the company actually generated and maintained revenue. He saw departments as isolated cost centers rather than interconnected components of a larger system. By the time I closed my laptop, it was past midnight. But I felt more energized than I had in months. The shock and anger had transformed into something more useful, a deep understanding of exactly what was about to happen and why it would be far worse than Marcus Webb could imagine. I walked to the window and looked out at the harbor, where the lights from the hotels and restaurants reflected off the dark water like scattered stars. Somewhere across the city, Marcus Webb was probably sleeping peacefully, confident that he'd made a smart business decision that would save the company money and improve efficiency. He had no idea that he'd just lit the fuse on a bomb that would explode his credibility and potentially destroy his career. The only question was how long it would take for the consequences to become visible, and whether I would still be around to watch the fallout. Tomorrow, I would begin the delicate process of documenting everything that was about to be lost. Not for my own protection, but because when the revenue started disappearing and the client relationships began deteriorating, someone would need to understand exactly what had gone wrong and why. Marcus Webb thought he was eliminating redundancy, but he was actually dismantling the invisible infrastructure that kept the company profitable. And unlike the technical systems that could be rebuilt, or the processes that could be redesigned, trust and relationships, once broken, were almost impossible to repair. The irony was that he would eventually discover his mistake, but only after it was far too late to undo the damage. By then, the redundant department that generated 89% of the company's sustainable revenue would be just a memory, and the man who destroyed it would be left trying to explain to the board how he'd managed to eliminate the very foundation of the business he was supposed to be optimizing. The first tremor came exactly 72 hours after Marcus Webb's announcement, arriving in the form of a panicked email from the accounting department at 11:37 on a Thursday morning. I was cleaning out my desk when the message appeared in my inbox with the red exclamation mark that indicated urgent priority. Rachel, emergency meeting needed regarding Morrison Industries' payment status. They've initiated a dispute process for their Q3 invoice and are threatening to withhold all payments pending resolution. Please advise immediately on next steps. Patricia Chen, accounts receivable. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a familiar mixture of vindication and dread. Morrison Industries represented $3 million in annual revenue, and their Q3 invoice alone was worth $750,000. More importantly, they were the canary in the coal mine. The first indication that the carefully maintained relationships were beginning to unravel exactly as I had predicted. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I considered how to respond. The official transition period for my department wouldn't end for another 2 weeks, which meant I was technically still responsible for handling client relationship issues. But Marcus Webb had made it clear that my team was redundant, which raised the question of whether I should even bother trying to save a relationship that would soon be someone else's responsibility. The decision was made for me when my phone rang. Jennifer Walsh's name appeared on the caller ID, and her tone when I answered was far different from our conversation 3 days earlier. Rachel, I need to speak with you immediately about the invoice dispute we filed. Our accounting department has identified several discrepancies in the billing that we need to resolve before we can process any payments. More importantly, we've had 3 separate communication failures with your project management team this week, and frankly, we're questioning whether your company is still capable of delivering the level of service we contracted for. I grabbed a notepad and began taking detailed notes as Jennifer outlined the issues. 2 missed deadline notifications, a technical specification that had been changed without client approval, and a project manager who had failed to return calls for 4 business days. Each problem was relatively minor on its own, but together they painted a picture of a company that was losing control of its client relationships. Jennifer, I understand your concerns, and I want to address each of these issues immediately. Can you give me until the end of the business day to investigate and get back to you with a comprehensive response? You have until 5 o'clock, Jennifer replied, her voice softening slightly. But Rachel, I need you to understand something. Morrison Industries has invested significant time and resources in building this partnership with your company. If we can't resolve these issues quickly and completely, we're going to have to start evaluating other options. I don't want to do that, but I have a responsibility to my own organization. After hanging up, I immediately began the process that had become second nature over the past 6 years. I pulled up Morrison Industries' complete account history, cross-referenced their current projects with our internal tracking systems, and began making calls to identify exactly what had gone wrong and why. The first discovery was that the project manager assigned to Morrison Industries had been pulled onto a higher priority client without anyone notifying Jennifer's team. The second was that the technical specification change had been implemented by a junior developer who didn't understand the approval process. The third was that the missed deadline notifications were the result of a software glitch that had affected several clients but hadn't been communicated to the account management team. None of these problems were catastrophic on their own, but they represented exactly the kind of systemic communication failures that my department had been designed to prevent. We served as the early warning system that identified these issues before they escalated into client disputes, and as the rapid response team that resolved them before they damaged relationships. By 4 o'clock, I had identified solutions for each of Morrison Industries' concerns and had coordinated with the appropriate internal teams to implement immediate corrections. I called Jennifer back with a detailed explanation of what had happened and what we were doing to prevent similar issues in the future. Thank you, Rachel, Jennifer said after I finished my explanation. This is exactly the kind of response I was hoping for. I'll authorize payment of the invoice, and we'll consider the matter resolved. But I have to ask, Who's going to be handling this kind of issue resolution after your department is eliminated? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I had been dreading this moment for 3 days, knowing that eventually a client would ask directly about the transition plan for their account management. The specifics are still being finalized, I replied carefully, but the company is committed to maintaining the same level of service and responsiveness that you've come to expect. It was a diplomatic non-answer that satisfied neither of us, but it bought time while the leadership team figured out how to handle the transition. What I didn't mention was that no transition plan actually existed, because Marcus Webb had assumed that client retention was a simple matter of answering phone calls and processing paperwork. That evening, I received a text message from David Park, one of my team members who had been reassigned to the customer service department. "Rachel, can you call me? I'm dealing with something that I don't think customer service is equipped to handle." David had been with the company for 4 years and had developed expertise in handling complex contract disputes and payment negotiations. He was particularly skilled at de-escalating situations where clients were threatening to terminate their relationships over service failures. When I called him back, his voice was strained with frustration. "I've been trying to resolve an issue with Coastal Manufacturing for 6 hours, and it's getting worse instead of better. They're threatening to cancel their entire contract over a billing error that should have been a 5-minute fix, but every person I transfer them to gives them a different answer." Coastal Manufacturing was another major client, representing about $2.5 million in annual revenue. They had a history of being extremely detail-oriented about their contracts and had very little tolerance for administrative errors. "What's the nature of the billing error?" I asked, already pulling up their account information on my laptop. They were charged for premium support services that they specifically opted out of when they renewed their contract 6 months ago. The charges total about $15,000, which isn't huge money for them, but they're furious about the principle of being charged for services they explicitly declined. I could immediately see the problem. Coastal Manufacturing had indeed opted out of premium support services, but their account had been flagged incorrectly in the billing system. It was the type of error that happened occasionally, and it should have been resolved with a simple credit and an apology. "Who have they been talking to about this?" I asked. "First customer service, then billing, then the sales manager who handled their contract renewal. Each department is pointing fingers at the others, and now the client is demanding to speak with someone who has actual authority to resolve the issue." This was exactly the scenario that my department had been designed to handle. We had the authority to issue credits, override billing decisions, and coordinate between departments to resolve complex issues quickly. More importantly, we had the institutional knowledge to understand which clients needed white-glove treatment and which ones would accept standard customer service responses. "David, transfer the call to me. I'll handle this one directly." Within 20 minutes, I had issued the credit, implemented a billing system flag to prevent similar errors, and provided Coastal Manufacturing with a direct contact number for future issues. The client went from threatening contract termination to expressing appreciation for the quick resolution. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that this was just the beginning. David would encounter dozens of similar situations over the coming weeks, and without the infrastructure of my department to support him, many of them would escalate into much larger problems. Over the weekend, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Instead of spending my final 2 weeks in a state of bitter resignation, I would use the time to create a comprehensive documentation system that would preserve as much institutional knowledge as possible. I arrived at the office early Monday morning and began the most important project of my career. Working 16-hour days, I created detailed profiles for every major client, documenting not just their contract terms and payment history, but their communication preferences, their key decision-makers, their hot-button issues, and the specific strategies that had proven effective in managing their relationships. Each profile included a crisis management protocol, step-by-step instructions for handling the types of problems that were most likely to arise with that particular client. I documented which internal departments needed to be involved in resolving different types of issues, which managers had override authority for specific decisions, and which external contacts could be leveraged when internal solutions weren't sufficient. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it was also strangely therapeutic. For 6 years, I had been building a complex system of relationships and processes, and now I was creating a roadmap that would allow someone else to navigate that system, even without my direct involvement. By Thursday of my final week, the documentation project had grown into something much larger than I had originally envisioned. I had created not just client profiles, but a comprehensive analysis of the revenue streams that my department had been protecting and generating. The numbers were even more dramatic than I had initially calculated. In addition to the direct revenue recovery efforts that averaged $8 million per year, my department's relationship management activities had prevented an estimated $12 million in annual revenue loss from client defections and contract downgrades. But the most significant revelation came when I analyzed the lifetime value calculations for the clients we had retained. The average client who had been through our recovery process stayed with the company 43% longer than clients who had never experienced service failures. More importantly, they increased their spending by an average of 31% over the 3 years following their recovery experience. The psychology was counterintuitive but powerful. Clients who had experienced problems and seen them resolved effectively developed stronger loyalty than clients who had never experienced problems at all. They had evidence that the company would go above and beyond to make things right when issues arose, which gave them confidence to expand their relationship and refer new business. This phenomenon meant that my department wasn't just recovering revenue that would have been lost. We were actually creating more valuable long-term relationships than the company would have had if the problems had never occurred in the first place. On Friday afternoon, my last official day with the company, I printed out the complete documentation system and locked it in the filing cabinet in what had been my office. The space had already been reassigned to a new hire in the marketing department, and my personal belongings were packed in 3 small boxes that sat on my desk like monuments to a career that was ending. Marcus Webb had scheduled a brief exit interview, which I suspected was more of a formality than a genuine attempt to gather feedback. He arrived 10 minutes late, carrying a tablet and wearing the same expensive suit that had impressed the board when they hired him. "Rachel, I want to thank you for your professionalism during this transition period. I know organizational changes can be challenging, but you've handled this situation with the kind of grace that reflects well on your character and your commitment to the company." His words were perfectly crafted corporate speak, designed to sound respectful, while revealing absolutely nothing about his actual thoughts or feelings. I wondered if he had ever delivered a genuine, unscripted response to anything in his professional life. "I've prepared a comprehensive transition document that should help whoever takes over client relationship management," I replied, gesturing toward the filing cabinet. "It includes detailed profiles for all major accounts, crisis management protocols, and revenue analysis data that might be useful for strategic planning." Marcus nodded absently, making notes on his tablet. "That's very thorough of you. I'm sure it will be helpful as we integrate those functions into our existing customer service and sales operations." I felt a flash of irritation at his casual dismissal of 6 years of specialized expertise, but I kept my expression neutral. There was no point in trying to explain something that he was fundamentally unwilling to understand. "Is there anything else you think I should know about the clients or the processes before you leave?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting that he was checking items off a predetermined list rather than genuinely seeking information. "Just that the relationships with these clients are more complex and more fragile than they might appear from the outside. Many of them have histories with the company that go back years, and they have very specific expectations about how their concerns should be handled. The institutional knowledge about managing those relationships isn't something that can be easily transferred or replicated." Marcus made another note on his tablet. "I appreciate that perspective, but I'm confident that our existing teams have the skills and experience to maintain these relationships effectively. Sometimes fresh approaches can actually improve outcomes." As I walked out of the building for the final time, carrying my 3 boxes and my employee ID card that would be deactivated at midnight, I felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with anticipation. For the first time in months, I wasn't worried about the phone calls that would come, the crises that would need to be resolved, or the relationships that would need to be carefully maintained. Those responsibilities now belonged to Marcus Webb and his existing teams, and I was genuinely curious to see how they would handle the challenges that I knew were coming. The documentation I had created would help, but only if someone bothered to read it and understood its significance. 2 weeks after my departure, I received a call from Jennifer Walsh. Her voice was tight with frustration and barely controlled anger. "Rachel, I'm calling because Morrison Industries is seriously considering terminating our contract with your former company. We've had 3 major service failures in the past 10 days, and every time we try to get them resolved, we get transferred between departments and given conflicting information. No one seems to have authority to make decisions, and no one understands our account history or our specific requirements." I listened carefully as Jennifer described the problems they had encountered: a missed project deadline that no one had communicated in advance, a billing error that had taken 4 days to correct, a technical support request that had been escalated through 5 different departments before someone finally understood what they were asking for. Each individual problem was minor, but together they painted a picture of a company that had lost control of its client relationships. More importantly, they represented exactly the types of issues that my department had been designed to prevent and resolve quickly when they did occur. "Jennifer, I'm no longer with the company, so I can't directly help you resolve these issues, but I would encourage you to escalate your concerns to the executive level and demand a meeting with someone who has decision-making authority. Make it clear that you're evaluating other options and that you need to see immediate improvements in service delivery." After hanging up, I realized that Jennifer's call was probably just the first of many that I would receive over the coming weeks. The clients who had developed relationships with my department would naturally reach out to me when they encountered problems, even though I no longer had any ability to help them. Each call would be a small confirmation that Marcus Webb had fundamentally misunderstood what my department actually did and why it was valuable. But more than that, each call would be evidence that the revenue foundation he thought he was preserving was actually crumbling beneath his feet. The irony was that by the time he realized his mistake, the damage would be irreversible. Trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. Relationships, once destroyed, rarely recovered their original strength. Revenue, once lost to competitor companies, seldom returned. Marcus Webb had thought he was eliminating a redundant cost center, but he had actually dismantled the invisible infrastructure that generated 89% of the company's sustainable revenue. And unlike the technical systems that could be rebuilt or the processes that could be redesigned, the human relationships that drove business success could not be restored with a simple policy change or organizational restructuring. The man who had confidently announced that my department was redundant was about to discover that some things only reveal their true value after they're gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.